Okay. I had some weird audio issues just now. I streamed the whole thing and the audio was, let's just say it was not great. So we're trying again. Just trying to push through that initial failure. So welcome. This is the weekly Q&A episode where I spend 10 minutes answering your questions. I actually do not have a audience submitted question today, so I thought I would spend a little bit of time reflecting on Epistle to Diognetus, the purpose of apologetics, and trying to sort of tie together a few things. So that's what we're going to do today. I am going to abide by my 10-minute limit because consistency is good in terms of audio quality and in terms of video length, I think. These are good things. Okay, here we go. 10 minutes. Let's do it. So the question I want to answer today is sort of, what is the end goal of apologetics in the Epistle to Diognetus? Last week, I gave my perspective on specifically presuppositional apologetics. And I think whenever we're talking about apologetics, we need to keep in mind, what is the goal? What are we actually trying to do here? And I think that's true as well for the Epistle to Diognetus, which, as we noted last Sunday, is sort of an early example of Christian apologetics. The author of Epistle to Diognetus is providing an explanation to Diognetus for why Christians worship and live the way that they do. And so I want to think a little bit about sort of the goal of that. Is the author just trying to give a rational explanation and leaving it at that, or is there more to it? There's more to it. I would say that the purpose of Epistle to Diognetus, or sort of the place where Diognetus is being drawn to, is a place of fuller knowledge of God, followed by imitation of God. And I wanted to actually bring in Karl Barth. I've been reading Karl Barth's Evangelical Theology. And for Barth, revelation is a big thing. Not the book of Revelation, but the self-revelation of God, which, of course, for Barth, finds its highest expression in Jesus Christ himself. But for Barth, the sort of covenantal relationship between God, the revealer, and the creatures, the humans who are the receivers of this revelation, is important. And so I wanted to actually read a bit from Karl Barth's introductory commentary to this book, Evangelical Theology. Barth says that God exists neither next to man, nor merely above him, but rather with him, by him, and most important of all, for him. He is man's God, not only as Lord, but also as Father, brother, friend. And this relationship implies neither a diminution nor in any way a denial, but instead a confirmation and display of his divine essence itself. A God who confronted man simply as exalted, distant, and strange, that is, a divinity without humanity, could only be the God of a dysangelion, of a bad news, instead of the good news. And Barth goes on to say that it's important not only that God is our God, but that we are his creatures, we are his people. There is a mutuality in our relationship with God. God initiates in condescending to us, in revealing himself to us in the incarnation, in Scripture. But we also respond. We are the proper recipients of that knowledge. We are created by God to know him. And so there is, as I said, a mutuality there. a reciprocal covenantal relationship that sort of is the context for our knowing of God. And so if we connect that with Epistle to Diognetus, I'll read from chapter 10 of Epistle to Diognetus. The author says, this is sort of his closing argument, if you will, to Diognetus. He says, "If you also strive after this faith, and first receive knowledge of the Father, for God loved humankind, for whom he made the world, to whom he subjected all things, the things in the earth, to whom he gave reason, to whom he gave mind, to whom alone he allowed to look above, to him, whom he made in his own image, to whom he sent his one and only Son, to whom he promised the kingdom in heaven, and will give it to those who love him." And so the author here is describing how humanity has been created to receive this knowledge of God. And having this knowledge, what joy do you think will fill you? Or how will you love the one who first loved you? But by loving him, you will be an imitator of his goodness. So God's initiating action in loving humanity leads to a greater knowledge of him, and this knowledge of God sort of comes to fruition in humanity's love for God. And that then spills over into imitating God. The author continues, "And do not wonder that a person is able to be an imitator of God. He is able, if God wills it. For in not oppressing one's neighbors, and to not desire to have even more than the weaker ones, and not being rich and compelling those more inferior, is being happy. And in these things no one is able to imitate God, but these things are outside the majesty of that one. But whoever takes up the burden of his neighbor, who wishes to do good to another who is worse off in that he is better off, who, having received things from God, he holds on to these things, providing to those in need. He becomes a God to those who receive them. This one is an imitator of God." So all that to say, when we do good to others, when we follow the biblical commands to love one's neighbor, we are imitating God, and we are making God's love known to those around us. "Then you will see, while being upon the earth, that God lives in heaven. Then you will begin to speak of the mysteries of God. Then you will both love and admire those being punished because they will not deny God. Then you will condemn the deceit and the deception of the world when you know what is the true life in heaven, when you despise the apparent death in this place, when you fear the true death, which is kept for those who will be condemned to the eternal fire, which will punish those handed over to it until the end. Then you will admire those who endure the temporary fire for the sake of righteousness, and will consider them blessed when you know that fire." So, in the mind of the author of Epistle to Diognetus, knowledge of God leads to love of God, which leads to imitation of God, which leads to a greater understanding of God's truth. And so, at the end of his apologetic to Diognetus, the author here is not seeking to simply persuade Diognetus of the truth or validity of his perspective or his worldview or his description of Christian ethic and practice. He's really saying, Diognetus, in order to understand what I have told you, you need to pursue this small knowledge that you have so that you can experience this imitation of God that I'm telling you about. And so this apologetic is not simply an intellectual thing. It is an invitation to taste and see that the Lord is good, so to speak. So I think that this is probably what should be at the forefront of our minds when we are thinking about apologetics. Apologetics is not simply about worldview issues, it's not simply intellectual, but its end goal should be persuading people to pursue knowledge of God, not so that their worldview will change, but so that their hearts would change, so that they too would become imitators of God. So I think the context of covenantal relationship is a helpful idea. God reveals himself so that we might enter into this covenantal relationship with him, wherein we are able to imitate him and to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. So, if you haven't really been following along with some of the texts that we've been looking at in this course, I would encourage you to just check out the Apostolic Fathers. I have been sort of focusing on maybe some of the more technical details of these texts, but there's really a lot to appreciate and a lot to reflect on in these texts. These are texts that Christians have been reading for a very long time, and there's a lot of good stuff in them. So, all that said, I commend to you the Epistle to Diognetus. It is well worth reading. It's very interesting, and hopefully very encouraging. With all of that said, I'll be picking things back up on Sunday, 3 p.m. We will be continuing our discussion of Christian persecution and early Christianity, thinking about some of the historical particularities, looking at the Neronian persecution, all the way up to the Decian persecutions, almost 150 years following Nero. So join us then. I look forward to continuing that discussion with you. And until then, peace be with you.